Good morning, sir. Coffee? I put artificial sweetener in your coffee, and I'm an artificial intelligence.
Thank you.
By the way, how did Neil Armstrong tie his shoes? In astronauts.
Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly meeting of both skeptics and believers, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. We've been doing it about 6 years now. We usually alternate. We do a Christian book one month, atheist book the next month. We do like to have respectful dialogue. And I would say that we want to also include that in any texting that we do. And it's will be greatly appreciated by all to have those kinds of conversations. I'm the one of the two co-founders of the club. I'm the Christian half of that equation. My name is James Walker. I am a Christian apologist. I work with an organization called Watchman Fellowship, a Christian apologetics ministry focusing primarily on alternative religions and interfaith evangelism. So we're interested in Islam, other world religions, cults, the occult, controversial doctrines, practices, spiritual leaders. But we also have an interest in atheism as well, thus the club. And our other co-founder, I'll introduce in a moment, Bill Cluck, former Christian, now atheist. So we have our guest this month, our guest author is Phil Bair. He studied philosophy, technology, and earth sciences, as well as music theory at the University of Iowa, at University of Colorado, the National Institute of Technology, and Simpson College in Iowa. He's been dedicated to the independent study and research of these issues for over 30 years in a variety of subject matters pertaining to the Christian worldview. His roles include author, speaker, Bible study leader, worship pastor, director of contemporary music, worship for several evangelical churches. He has served as a philosophy consultant and speaker for Rivendell, a cultural apologetics organization founded in Denver, Colorado, and now headquartered in Santa Barbara, California. One more thing about Phil. He is also a longtime member of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. And I was trying to remember, I think we've had 4 or 5 other book club members who have actually presented their own books in the club. So a lot of our club members, or at least our regulars, our longtime members, are themselves authors as well. Welcome to, well, I should say, welcome back, Phil, to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Hi.
I'm going to ask Phil, I'm going to ask Bill, our other co-founder, to talk just a minute about our upcoming book for next month, our September book that we're going to be looking at. And then we will give him the opportunity as our atheist co-founder to ask you, the Christian, the first question of tonight. So Bill Cluck is my longtime friend. He is a former Christian, now atheist. So Bill, you want to tell us about next month's book?
Yeah, first of all, Phil, I enjoyed your talk with the friendly atheist. But to be honest with you, Phil, you guys are just too intellectual. We're going to dumb it down and go to juvenile Christianity. Here's the book. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Do the New You by Stephen Furtick. Stephen Furtick is pastor of Elevation Church. He's worth $65 million. He's 43. But the whole key here is it's all about you. It's not about God anymore and a sovereignty God. That's out the window. Here's the thing. He explores and unpacks 6 practical mindsets that everyone can adopt to get from who you are today to where God is taking you. These 6 statements are truths you can speak over yourself anytime, anywhere. Number 1, I'm not stuck unless I stop. Christ is in me. I am enough. With God, there's always a way, and my faith will find it. God is not against me, but he's in it with me, working through me, fighting for me. These are so
Okay,
profound.
Bill, you're fired.
My
Okay,
job is
we're
my
not going to
job.
let you pick the Christian book ever again. I would
No,
rather
I think
read
this was
another
the atheist book.
Yes,
I
I'd
know
rather
we
read
can
a
count
good
it as an
atheist book.
atheist book. My job is my job. I mean, that took a lot of thought. God has given me everything I need for the season I'm in. These simple, powerful, memorable phrases will shift your focus, feelings, and actions to align with God's vision of you. So it's all about me, getting me to the next level, getting me to financial success, getting me to happiness and great relationships. God, you're just not involved anymore. So, and it's interesting, these hip, cool churches that are just spreading out everywhere. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, they have Transformation Church, who just hired Carl Lentz. Carl Lentz was with that heretical, terrible church, Hillsong, out of Australia, that had a branch here in Dallas, who gets caught into adultery. Hey, no big deal. Are you hip? Oh, hip. Carl says to Michael Todd, I hung out with Justin Bieber with my shirt off, drinking shots. Well, you're as cool as it gets. You can be our next associate pastor. We want you involved. So, Bill, here's my question. If me and Ken or whoever were to become a Christian, should we become a hip, cool Christian where we're the center of everything? Or shall we become a Calvinist where God's sovereign, we're just worms? He's the most. So which one is it, Phil? Which ones should I choose?
Well, I think you would be making a choice between that would be a false dichotomy. So I don't think the choice is between I want to be a Christian where everything is centered on me, or I'm going to be a Christian where God's sovereignty is defined as exhaustive determinism over all things about humanity. I don't think those are the only two options. But I definitely would not recommend becoming a self-centered Christian where you believe that the world and that God himself all revolves around you. That would.
But
It,
Phil, it aligns perfectly with my atheism. It's all about me. And an interesting story, John MacArthur, they asked him, Steve Furtick, what do you think? He goes, unqualified. So what's interesting, Stephen heard him on YouTube. He goes, "Oh my God, you just talked about mentioned my favorite subject, myself." So he goes and writes a book called Unqualified, which is just total garbage. It's just, I mean, isn't it sad what Christianity has become, Phil?
well, I think it's sad what a part of Christianity has become. So there is a large sector in Christianity where people are focused on themselves, and there's a large contingent of health and wealth ideology that has invaded Christianity. And then I wrote a book on this as well. Marxism has invaded Christianity as well. So Christianity is being poisoned. The body of Christ is being poisoned, and those poisons have a lot of names, and selfishness is one of them, definitely. I would not ever recommend becoming a selfish Christian. I would recommend becoming a biblical Christian and following Christ's mandate to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow him at all costs. And so when we do that, I think what happens is the selfishness diminishes, and we begin to realize that this is not all about ourselves. That it is all revolving around God. However, there are different ways that you can look at Christianity as being all about God and beginning with God and ending with God. And the path of determinism, where God is put on the pedestal and he's put first as the top priority over all of existence and over all of creation, over all of reality, that deterministic model, I wouldn't recommend that either, because it actually doesn't put God at the top of the priority list. Its implications are that God is not the God of truth that we find in the Bible. So I would recommend that if you become a Christian again, that you become a Christian that is dedicated to the study of the scriptures, which you've already done, by the way. And I know very well how familiar you are with the scriptures. And so I would recommend following the path of, that Jesus said that the way to destruction is wide. And all of these various ideologies like Marxism and meism, the whole self-centered gospel, all those things are wide and they're very easy ways to be a Christian, but they're not ways to be a true, authentic Christian. And so if you become a Christian again, I would recommend getting involved in lots of discussions that relentlessly pursue what it means to be an authentic follower of Christ and to put God first in everything.
Well, what's sad, Phil, is these people have a voice. Robert Morris just resigned because what else? Some sort of affair thing. And what would made him so? He's was the pastor of Gateway Church, which has like 6 locations. Goes to 190 countries. And what was so dangerous about him was he wasn't so blatant. Hey, give me $1,000. Okay, God, I sowed my seeds. Time for you to pay up, Buster. He was far more subtle, and that's what made him so dangerous. So what's sad is these people like Joel Osteen, who totally contrary to what the Bible says. He says 99% of the people are good, totally contrary to what the Bible says, that everyone's bad. But who cares about the Bible if that's not relevant anymore? So what I'm saying, they have this huge voice. And I met a girl on a cruise ship and she had Joel Osteen's book and she goes, "Oh, this is my Christianity." That's Christianity to the third world countries. The exportation of this heresy is just ridiculous. I mean, what do you think?
Phil, Bill, I would agree with Phil that I would not recommend the hip church for several reasons. One of them is if you go to the hip church, you're not going to fit in. Because you're like me, a $400 pair of jeans and a sports car is not going to make us hip. So it's too late for us on that.
It's too late.
So I would recommend
stuck,
that you go to a Bible-based church. And I will say this about you, Bill. One thing that's a mystery to me in my 6 or 7 years I've known you as an atheist, you don't believe Christianity is true, but you're very concerned about keeping it pure and making it the right form of Christianity. I found that to be fascinating fact about you. Even if you don't agree with it, you see the difference between a more biblical form of Christianity and other things that are out there promoting themselves as Christian.
Well, yeah,
Bill wants to argue with true
I just go with what the
Christianity.
Bible says.
Yeah, Bill has to have the true Christianity in place so he can have the good arguments.
That's
You
all.
can't argue against bad Christianity. Well, I guess we will next month.
Yeah, the other thing that I would absolutely strongly recommend is if anyone wants to return to Christianity from atheism, I want you to do it in a way where you maintain your intellectual integrity. Because if you can't return to Christianity and maintain your intellectual integrity at the same time, I don't want you to return to Christianity.
Well, as you said in the interview, Phil, C.S. Lewis said, "My heart cannot rejoice to what my mind rejects."
Right.
What's happening today is they could care less. The typical Christian, this hip church, whether it's true or not does not matter. They could have the bones of Jesus. And you were honest enough. I can respect you when you say, look, if you produce the bones of Jesus, Christianity's false. I believe in a real historical Jesus. I've actually taken the time, a lot of time, to read this and believe because of the facts, the evidence of Christianity. They don't care about these in the hip church. It's not about the Bible and God. It's about being cool and being the best. Look at Joel Osteen's book, Your Best Life Now. Well, did Paul have his best life when he was beaten and shipwrecked and imprisoned? Did he, Phil?
No. Well, yes and no. He had his best life in the sense that he was following Christ and he was giving up everything for Christ, and he was willing to suffer for the sake of his allegiance to Christ. In that sense, you could argue that is his best life, but
it wasn't the health and wealth gospel, right?
Yeah, if you want to define your best life as having the most money in your bank account and having 10 houses and tons of boats and all sorts of luxuries, then no, Paul, I obviously didn't have that best life. But that's not the life he wanted. He wanted the life where he was pleasing to Christ. So, a lot of it depends on how you define your best life. But did I say if you find the bones of Jesus, if you show me the bones of Jesus, that I'll be the first to walk
Well,
away
in
from
other words,
Christianity?
what I'm saying, Phil, is you care about the evidence. That's the important thing.
Yeah, because I do say that. That's the reason I asked you, is because I thought, did I say that in a previous book club session or something? Because
No, I don't think. I thought I heard on YouTube, but I could be wrong.
well,
But the important thing,
yeah,
if Jesus came down and said, "Look, I'm just a failed apocalyptic prophet. I'm not God," you would, you know.
yeah,
But with these Christians, they make me so sick. They wouldn't skip a beat. They'd go, "Oh, it's third day coming on next week." I mean, it's not about Christ anymore. The Bible's just a footnote now.
right.
You know.
Well, one of my heroes of the Christian faith is a fellow by the name of Francis Schaeffer, and he's actually my philosophical hero as well as my Christian theological hero. And he was the one that I read a long time ago who said, if you find the bones of Jesus Christ, I'll be the first one to step out of the queue. That was his terminology. But his thesis in his book called The God Who Is There. I don't know if you ever read that or not.
Oh, Francis Schaeffer was our mentor when I was a Christian. That's how we
Yeah.
all read. Yeah.
Right. So in his book, The God Who Is There, he said that the current gap between the generations is a result of a shift in the concept of truth. So we live in a postmodern society where truth is no longer real. Truth is no longer a priority, and people don't care about truth. If you don't care about truth, you're not going to care about Christian truth. So if you're influenced by the whole postmodern movement, then if you're a Christian, then you're not going to be the right kind of Christian that God expects you to be and that God wants you to be, because God wants you to adhere to the truth. And Jesus said he's the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. So truth is one of God's highest priorities. If it's not the highest priority of a Christian, then you're not the right kind of Christian. I'm sorry. If that's a harsh language, then so be it.
I mean, Justin Peters does a great job exposing these guys. One of the worst, absolute worst, is Jesse Duplantis, where Jesus speaks and says, "Jesse, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to talk to you." And Jesse goes, "I'll clear my schedule." Isn't that big of him to clear his schedule for Jesus? So he goes to heaven like you go to the grocery store. The Apostle Paul says, "Man, what a great house, Apostle Paul." And he goes, "Wait to see yours, Jesse." It's just pure blasphemy and heresy. So anyway, let's get to your book.
Well,
You're
before we
familiar
do that, Bill, okay, first of all, you lost your job as picking the next book. Okay, so
Thank
everybody, well, I'm watching everybody right now. Thumbs up or thumbs down on his suggested book. Thumbs down. Thank you.
God.
Thank you. Okay, so
Hey, I tried,
what is your
Stephen.
plan B? Do you have a plan B for us for
I
our
thought we had
September book?
thought we were going to do a problem of evil with we're going to do Oppie's book, even though I couldn't get him.
Yeah, are
Yeah.
you familiar with Oppie, Phil?
Yeah. Oh, sure.
He has a small problem of evil four views book he's in that came out. I thought we were going to do that one, but I guess not.
Yeah, we are. I was just kidding.
Oh, you were kidding.
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay.
He ran that by me ahead of time, and I said, "We will shoot
Okay.
you down, but we'll let you say it first,
Good, I
and then we'll shoot
succeeded.
you down."
Bill, you got me. You fooled me, Mr. Cluck.
We actually
the name of the book. Yeah, let me
go
go get that. It's the name of the book is Conversations About God and the Problem of Evil. The author's Graham Oppie. He is a PhD philosopher in Australia. He's been a guest author twice before in years past on the book club. We have not got a confirmation. We're hoping to get him to represent his book. I think that's very possible, but we haven't got that secured yet. So we want to do the book anyway. It's just a 90-page book, Conversations About God and the Problem of Evil. Came out in 2021. Only 90 pages, $15. It's a quick read. Oppie himself, Dr. Oppie is an Australian philosopher whose main area of research is philosophy of religion. He currently holds the post of professor of philosophy and associate dean of research at Monash University. He was elected fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities in 2009. His background, he deconverted from Christianity to atheism as a teenager, and is the author of numerous books, including the one we're going to be looking at next week. And we will let you know. It's going to be Thursday, September 5th at 7 p.m. And we will let you know more about that on our website, atheistchristianbookclub.com. And you can always see what's coming up next there, have links to the book. We usually try to have also a free video alternative. If you don't have time to read the book or finish the book, if you watch that video for an hour or maybe a 2-hour video, you should be prepped enough to come in for the conversation and participate. So that said, that's going to be our next month's book. And so, Bill, do you have a lead-off? Before you did the lead-off question, I almost forgot. For the rest of us that are in the room, if you'll do this as a big favor to us, if you do want to ask a question, if you will put that in the text, then either one of our two moderators, Daniel Ray or Brady Blevins, will call you up and ask you to unmute. We've had this request as well, and we will honor it. If you want to know the answer to a question, but you don't want to come on camera and ask the question yourself, that's fine. You can, in the text, say, would you ask this question for me? And one of us will then ask the question and let Phil address that particular comment or question. So I'm sorry now. Go ahead, Bill. You have a question.
Phil, you're
Can I do that?
Yeah, no, not you.
Phil, you're familiar with the evolutionary argument against naturalism by Plantinga, correct?
Yes.
So what it's saying, if we evolve to survive, to flourish, whatever, not necessarily to find true facts. If this is just a materialistic, reductive sort of thing, then how can we actually know morals, truth, or whatever when we're handicapped by this haphazard, random evolutionary view?
Well, the short answer is we can't. And how many of you read the book, My Book, Machines Don't Laugh? So the last chapter deals with this question, and the evolutionary argument against naturalism is just one in a large family of arguments. And the main one that I am the most familiar with and I have been most influenced by is the one from C.S. Lewis, where he argued against naturalism and argued against the ability to reason under naturalism. And so the argument that I present in the book is essentially that if God does not exist, then what we are left with is natural law as the ultimate reality. And everything that occurs in the universe can trace itself back to the operation of the forces of nature as its cause. And there's a long chain of cause and effect relationships that stretch back to however long you want to go back, whether you want to go back to an eternal universe and go back to an infinite past, or whether you want to go back to the beginning of a universe, whatever it happens to be, everything that exists in the universe and everything that occurs in the universe is caused by natural law. And so the argument goes, and this is the version that I favor, that I prefer, but it is by no means a unique argument in its core structure. But the argument that I like is that if God does not exist, then natural law ultimately determines all things that occur in the universe. And that means that natural law is the antecedent conditions that necessitate all effects and all events in the universe. Now, if natural law is the ultimate cause of all things that occur in the universe, then it follows that natural law is the ultimate cause of all of our beliefs. And if natural law is the cause of all of our beliefs, natural law is the cause of all of our false beliefs. And that follows necessarily, because if natural law causes all my beliefs, it has to cause all my false beliefs. And as an aside to that, we know that we all have false beliefs. None of us have absolute true ideology, and for Christians, none of us have absolute truth theology in every case. We do have some false beliefs. We know that's true. And part of the reason we know that's true also is because theologians and philosophers and and thinkers and scientists, they disagree with each other. So if one philosopher contradicts another philosopher, one of them is wrong and one of them is right. And so that means that we know we have false beliefs, and we know that under naturalism, natural law is what causes all of those false beliefs. The next premise is that if natural law causes all of our false beliefs, then natural law is deceptive. Because the definition of to deceive is to cause to hold a false belief. So if natural law is deceptive, then natural law is untrustworthy as a source of knowledge. And if natural law is untrustworthy as a source of knowledge, then it is impossible for us to know which of our beliefs are true or false, because they are all determined by natural law, and natural law is untrustworthy. So all of our beliefs are determined by natural law, and natural law is untrustworthy. It follows that we cannot trust any of our beliefs to be true or false. If we can't trust any of our beliefs to be true or false, then human epistemology is absolutely impossible. It's completely wiped out. And so the problem with that is that, well, there are tons and tons of problems that emerge from that. If we can't know anything because the cause of all of our knowledge is unreliable and untrustworthy, then we can't do science. Science is impossible. In other words, science is ultimately impossible if God does not exist. And one of the things that is ironic about this is that the science is destroyed by the very ideology that inspired the atheists to believe in science. And there's, as far as I can tell, and I have worked on this problem for years and years, and I have discussed this with a whole army of people who come from a variety of backgrounds, atheism and philosophy and science and theology. I have never, ever heard anyone solve this problem.
Well,
Bill,
wait a minute.
did you want to push back on that? What's the weakest of the syllogism? What's the weakest link in there?
Oh, by the way, Ken
Are you-
Daniels, you can help solve the problem, can't you, Ken? Ken? Okay, he's muted or something. Anyway, what he would say is that we have the scientific method, double-blind studies that can correct our poor cognitive skills and our false beliefs. Isn't that true, Phil?
No, not under naturalism, because our entire methodology is based on a set of presuppositions, none of which we can trust if natural law causes all of our false beliefs. So we can't even reason if naturalism is true. If naturalism is true, natural law causes all of our beliefs, causes all of our false beliefs, is therefore it's an unreliable source of knowledge, but it's our only source of knowledge.
Bill, could it be
Our
argued?
beliefs are all determined by natural law. If that's the case, it's impossible for us to reason, because in order to reason, you have to know the truth of the premises in the argument that you're considering at any given moment. If you can't know the truth of the premises, you can't know that the argument is actually a successful argument, and you can't know whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises, because that requires a certain degree of knowledge as well, which is also impossible under naturalism.
Phil, I would say, taking a skeptic's point of view here, you have standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon. I jump off. Whether I call it gravity or chicken soup, I'm at the bottom of the canyon unless I have some kind of a parachute. And I know, in talking to a lot of atheists and skeptics, they will say that we can certainly learn something from our environment Whether you think falling down into the Grand Canyon is an illusion, that certainly that even if it's all natural, um, I know I just leapt from the canyon and I'm about to die. Certainly that counts for something. So can't we translate from physical empirical kinds of knowledge like that to our presuppositions?
No,
Why
no,
not?
because our empirical processes that we when we think we are observing the Grand Canyon, when we think we are observing whether that the fact that we're falling, when we even the existence of all of those things is based on a set of beliefs that we can't trust. So we can't even trust our belief that the Grand Canyon even exists. We can't even trust our belief that we have bodies and that gravity is going to pull our bodies to the bottom of that Grand Canyon and make a bad day for us. None of all of those things. So the thing that's important to understand about this is that natural law is deterministic in the sense that it is exhaustively deterministic. Natural law determines everything that occurs in the universe, including all of our beliefs, including everything about humanity and including all of our beliefs. So our belief that the Grand Canyon exists is also determined by natural law, and natural law is untrustworthy. Therefore, we can't rely on, we can't trust the belief that the Grand Canyon exists, and we also can't trust our senses because our senses are supposedly communicating something to our brains, but we have no idea whether or not our brains are capable of gathering accurate information about the external world through these senses, because that's just another one of those beliefs that could be caused, or that is caused by natural law, and it could be a deceptive. It could,
Don't you have the
let me
don't you
see if
have
I can push back on that for a second, Phil. Is it could it be argued though that because all Christians have different ideas and different some false beliefs, even every Christian has some false beliefs, that it could be argued that relying on the scriptures, the leading of the Holy Spirit, and all whatever Christians have to go on in addition to the senses and other ways of acquiring knowledge, that too is not trustworthy, because the scriptures and the leading of the Holy Spirit is both the author of those right beliefs, but also the wrong beliefs as well. Could that be argued the same way?
well, it could be. It depends on what flavor of determinism that you're considering when you talk about the scriptures and the Holy Spirit, because there are two forms of determinism that I usually deal with, and there may be more, but there's two primary ones. One of them is naturalistic determinism, which we've been discussing, the determinism that occurs if there is no God. But the other kind of determinism is theistic determinism, and that's the essential principle behind Calvinism, and that is that God is the ultimate cause of all things that occur in the universe. So God's will is the antecedent conditions that are the cause of all things, and therefore God's will causes all of my beliefs. If God's will causes all of my beliefs, well, and I have no free will, then that means that I'm also being determined to believe everything that I believe, which means that I'm being determined to believe every false belief that I have. And that means that if God determines all of my beliefs, then human epistemology is destroyed again. So as
But
long as
if Christians and atheists both end up with a set of beliefs, some of which are false and some of which are true, or if you don't want to use the word belief, maybe a lot of atheists react against that word, a set of things that they know to be true, that are partly right and partly wrong. If both Christians and atheists end up with this mixed set of truths, then what's the benefit or the advantage of the Christianity?
well, the advantage of Christianity is to recognize that God is not deterministic. That if God exists and Christianity is true, God does not determine all things about humanity the way Calvinism says he is. Because determinism, exhaustive determinism, whether it's theistic or naturalistic, destroys human epistemology, period, wholesale.
So
It
you're
doesn't
arguing
matter.
both forms of determinism are wrong, is what
Both
you're arguing.
both
Okay.
forms of determinism are self-defeating, and they must be false because,
Would you qualify that with a soft versus hard version of both forms of determinism?
well, I'm not really a big fan of differentiating between hard and soft determinism, because either God, let's take the theistic determinism example. Either God determines all things that occur in the universe, or he doesn't. And if God does not determine all things that occur in the universe, then you don't have determinism, because determinism is by nature is exhaustive, because we as Christians would acknowledge that God does determine some things. It's just that we want to stop short of saying that he determines all things. And whenever you say that God determines some things that occur in the universe, that's not determinism, because determinism, the definition of determinism is that that all things are determined, whether or not it's God who's determining them or whether natural law is determining them. So yeah, if I don't like the whole soft versus hard distinction when it comes to determinism, because either all things are determined or they're not. And if all things are determined, all our beliefs are determined. If all our beliefs are determined, then we can't trust any of our beliefs, because we don't know that the false beliefs that we're being determined are being determined by something that is aimed at truth, especially in the case of naturalism. But there are people who will push back on the theistic determinism principle, and they will say, well, God wouldn't cause us to hold false beliefs. God would not deceive us. He wouldn't be a deity of deception. God is good, and he's benevolent. So God wouldn't cause us to have false beliefs. But the problem is that could be just one more belief that God has placed in your mind that you can't trust, because everything that you believe is being determined.
Well, something caused us to have false beliefs. And
Right.
if that the determinism would say if God causes all things, then that would include that.
Right. So he would cause all false beliefs. And that means he's the deity of deception, because if God determines our false beliefs, then he's a deity of deception, because deception means to cause to have false beliefs. And
We'll get our friend Bill out of this dilemma. So what's the solution to all this?
well, the solution is to abandon determinism. And the problem for the atheist is that if you abandon naturalistic determinism, you have to abandon atheism, because you can't have the non-existence of God and supernatural reality at the same time. Because if God does not exist, then naturalism is the inevitable and necessary consequence of the lack of God's existence.
Okay,
The
about
problem is,
several years ago,
that naturalism leads to determinism, and determinism destroys knowledge, and so that's where the whole thing, that's where the whole mountainside gives way, and you have this huge rock slide, where everything falls apart.
But Phil, several years ago, I think before you joined the club, we did the Sam Harris book, Free Will. And as an atheist, Sam Harris makes it's a little short book, but a very compelling case that if he's right, there is no God, that we have to be in determinism. He sets the case up for that. But about half the atheists at the book club were adamant that he was wrong about that. They didn't really argue specific philosophical reasons for the most part of why he was wrong, but it was just like everybody knows that we make decisions and have free will, at least on some level. And so there isn't a form of atheism that could be also libertarian.
I think if it would be, then it would involve a massive leap of faith, because Sam Harris is right. And by the way, I quoted Stephen Hawking, and Hawking referred to Laplace when he talked about how everything in the universe is determined by natural law, and that everything about humanity is just as determined as the orbit of the planets. So if someone wants to deny that naturalism leads to determinism and destroys free will, then I want to hear an argument that refutes that conclusion. And that's when I said earlier that I've never heard anyone even offer an argument that actually refutes the conclusion or the argument that naturalism leads to determinism.
Well,
And
the
so,
arguments we were getting in the book club were mostly that it's self-evident, that it's a brute fact, that but you can't live your life without operating, knowing that there's such a thing as free will. It was the argument from experience more so than
right.
a philosophical argument.
And I agree with that argument from experience, but you have to understand that that argument is an argument against atheism, not for atheism. It's an argument against naturalism. Because
What do you think, Bill? Do you think we have free will?
I'm just glad I don't have EDD, you know.
Phil, if
exhausted
the will,
divine determinism,
Yeah.
if the will is, if there is such a thing as, let's say determinism, as you're suggesting here, is it destroys knowledge. So is the inverse of this that there is creaturely freedom, or maybe I'll say volitional freedom in terms of the will? If that's the case, from what is our volition free? Like it seems like to me that there would still be something impacting our choosing ability, for lack of a better word, or our volition. So if thinking theistically here for a moment, or maybe not, if we truly have a kind of a libertarian free will in our souls or in our persons, in our beings, in our ontology, from what would you argue that it is free? From what is it free?
it's free.
What is the freedom they're suggesting?
It's a freedom from being determined by antecedent conditions that necessitate those choices,
Whether it's God or natural law.
So right. you're absolutely in a volitional vacuum, in other words.
Well, I don't know what you mean by a volitional vacuum.
Nothing is impinging or infringing or influencing my volitional ontology.
Nothing from outside of me is necessitating my choices if I have free will.
You could argue that's determined, though, by nature or God.
Pardon me?
Couldn't you argue that would be either determined by nature or by God to have your ontology set up that way?
Well, there's a difference between being created by God and being determined by God. God can create us to have the faculty of free will, but that doesn't mean that he has determined the choices that we make within that free will. Now, whenever we talk about theistic determinism, I always want to point out that one of my best friends is a guy named Dr. Tim Stratton. In fact, I'm going to see him tomorrow. We're going to have coffee tomorrow. And Dr. Stratton uses the term exhaustive divine determinism. And people will complain that he uses the word exhaustive because they say that it's redundant, that determinism is exhaustive by nature. But the reason that Dr. Stratton, and I agree with him, is the reason that he wants to use the word exhaustive is because it makes the point clear that exhaustive divine determinism means that everything is determined. And the fact that some things may be determined does not mean that all things are determined. And so some people would like to use the word determinism and they want to take the exhaustive idea out of it. And they wanted to say, well, God does determine some things. Doesn't God determine some things if he exists? And the answer to that is, yes, he does determine some things. And so you could make the case that God determined that we would have free will. But that doesn't mean that he determines the choices that we make within the scope of that free will. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it sounds like that's where you were going with that.
Yeah, I think in the discussion, the freedom part is often poorly defined or exegeted in that capacity. It always gets down to a veil an epistemological veil, I think, because the more you talk about it, the more it seems like you go behind the veil and you're saying things that I mean, at some point, Phil, doesn't omniscience sort of creep into this problem? I mean, whether it's nature that is deterministic or God who knows everything, that we have to at some point concede a limitation epistemologically about what we can know about this subject, right? I mean, it can't be, if you solve it tonight, you get a Nobel Prize in literature and science and philosophy, probably. But does that make sense? I mean, I think the idea of freedom is problematic, whether you're an atheist or a Christian, I think, because something brought me here. Something is motivating me. I always feel impinged upon by outside forces when I make decisions. And but I think in a theistic sense, though, isn't the whole discussion about will really related to salvation and not like whether I should go to Walmart or Aldi's for Saturday shopping? I think that kind of gets confused sometimes too. We're talking about like day-to-day choices versus like choosing to be saved kind of thing. That's where the discussion goes often
Right.
off the rails.
Yeah, there is I mean, if you want to talk about Calvinistic theology, in Calvinism, there's two kinds of Calvinism. There's there's a soteriological Calvinism, which is soteriological determinism, and then there is just Calvinism that says that not only is salvation deterministic, but all of life is deterministic. So there are some Calvinists who say, I'm only a tulip Calvinist, I'm only determinist when it comes to salvation issues. And so the fact that I put my faith in Christ, that was determined for me. I didn't make that decision. God made that decision for me. But I make the decisions whether or not to wear a red shirt or a blue shirt tomorrow. So determinism is only limited to soteriology in that particular theological framework. But it would be helpful if you're feeling like we're getting into the weeds or we're getting veiled in terms of our definitions, I would offer two definitions. Something is determined if antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate an effect. If that's the case, that effect is determined. If something is a libertarian free choice on the part of a human being, that means that that antecedent conditions are insufficient to necessitate the choice that I make. If that's the case, then the choice I made was a libertarian free choice. And the reason why we use the word antecedent is that we're talking about conditions that exist outside of ourselves. So if antecedent conditions that are outside of myself are sufficient to necessitate my choice was determined. But if antecedent conditions were insufficient to necessitate my choice, then my choice was not determined. And if that's the case, then the origin of the choice was me. I made a creative choice for myself. I was not determined to make that particular choice.
So in the theological vernacular, you made a decision ex nihilo?
Pretty much, yeah. I think you could say that, but
okay.
There's a lot of discussion about that because some theologians, some free will philosophers and theologians who are theists, a lot of them say that no, the choice didn't come out of nothing. The choice came out of various factors that exist within me. That where I made a creative choice, so the choice was not necessitated. The choice was not caused by something external to me, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. It didn't come out of nothing. In other words, we didn't create a choice out of nothing. And some of them will say that no, we do create choices. We do make choices that come out of nowhere, that come out of nothing, and that we're simply created by the fact that we are creative people or creative beings that are made in God's image, and God is creative, and therefore he installed creativity into human beings.
Well, Phil, let me give you a concrete example, okay? We're here in Texas Longhorn country. You have a little child and they dress them in little Texas Longhorn sweatshirts and Texas Longhorn caps. Every Sunday, they watch every Texas Longhorn game. They go to the games. There's no way he has a choice to be an Oregon Duck. Who would want to be an Oregon Duck anyway? So do you see it's this long, and Sam Harris uses, there's this long causation chain of events that will lead him to become a Texas Longhorn, and he has no choice in the matter.
Hey, Bill, my son's a Sooner.
You got to be kidding. Well, thanks for destroying my argument.
I couldn't resist.
Oh, now that
Yeah, well, I think what you're describing is what I would call powerful influences.
yes.
And you could make an argument that it's an impossible for someone to overcome a powerful influence, and that the reason they can't overcome that powerful influence is because they don't have enough strength. They're too weak to overcome those influences. That's not the same as determinism, because determinism says that antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate a choice. And in the case of a powerful influence may overwhelm someone, and it might cause them to make a certain choice, but that doesn't mean that it was not a freedom permitting circumstance. I moved to Colorado, and I had powerful influences to become a Bronco fan, and now I am a Bronco fan. But I could choose not to become a Bronco fan. And
Well,
so,
unfortunately, we can't choose to not become a Dallas Cowboy fan, even though I've been here 14 years, witnessed 14 non-playoff things that didn't lead to a Super Bowl or whatever.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, Phil, is
Well-
it's the same for being a Christian. When I was 17, Jainism was not on the table. I had no influence there. I had all these biases. I had seminaries. I had the Young Life guys coming to our high school. I had churches that I grew up in. I had so much bias. There's no way I wasn't going to become a Christian. It wasn't a free choice. It was my culture choosing, not me choosing. Does that make sense?
But you did choose to leave, though. So
yeah, you
it
chose to leave. I
wasn't
said, what are you now? Are you still
Yeah.
a Christian?
No. I mean, well, and there again, I read Bart Ehrman's book. I might have seen a Christopher Hitchens video. So I had all these atheist influences that framed my decision, right?
Yeah, there's such a thing as a powerful influence, and it's possible for some people to be unable to overcome a powerful influence, and it's possible for other people to be unable to overcome a powerful influence. Did I say unable twice?
Yes.
Well,
Some
a
people can,
perfect
some people
example
can't.
is James, where he did overcome his Mormonism, but he's the exception. They told me, Brady was telling me that it takes 7 years for a Mormon to wake up, and they're believing just absolute nonsense.
Yeah, but we have to make sure that we differentiate between a powerful influence and something that is determined. So if something is determined, then that means that it was impossible for someone to resist that choice or that influence. And what we're trying to differentiate between now is exhaustive determinism and non-exhaustive determinism. Some things are determined, and if you want to argue that someone was determined to be a Dallas Cowboys fan, then if you want to make that argument, then I'll grant that argument for the sake of the discussion. But that doesn't mean that all things are determined like someone was determined to be a Dallas Cowboys fan. And that's the distinction, and that's the important factor in what we're talking about. Because if exhaustive determinism is true, whether it's theistic or naturalistic, that means everything down to the lowest level of specificity is determined and cannot be otherwise. If that's the case, then all of our beliefs are determined, and we are incapable of believing anything other than what we believe. That's
Hey,
where.
Phil, Ken Daniels had a question along these lines. Do you think, does God have foreknowledge of my future free choices?
Yes.
So it's not God is not limited in his foreknowledge about the future.
No, God knows the future exhaustively, and one of the principles that we need to make sure that we embrace and that we observe is that knowledge is not causal. The fact that I know ahead of time that someone is going to crash their car into, into a brick wall tomorrow, the fact that I know that that's going to happen did not cause that to happen. So if God is omniscient, that does not mean that all things are determined simply because God knows all things. And that's one of the biggest fallacies in philosophy that we see often. And that's why some people become open theists, because they believe that if God knows all things, he therefore causes all things, and they can't live with the possibility that God causes all things. And so they retreat from the principle that God knows all things. And I think that's a mistake because knowledge is not causal.
Well, hey, Ken, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Look at Ken Daniels. Has missionary parents. Was there any way you weren't going to become a Christian, Ken?
I suppose statistically, it was unlikely. I mean, there were some acquaintances that in their teenage years left the faith that had similar backgrounds to mine. Usually, it doesn't happen when you're before a teenager, maybe 10 at the youngest. But in my case, I was age 32. I think it's probably more common as a teenager, but I don't know if I'm getting at the answer to your question. I think that it's difficult for us as limited cognitive beings to really even know where determinism ends and free will starts, if there is such a thing as free will. I think we tend to maybe kid ourselves to think I really did choose that freely. We just don't know the complex series of motivations and cascading sequence of events that led to why we did want that thing that we chose.
Like you read a Robert Price book. I mean, there's a bias, an atheist bias, right? That an atheistic cause.
Yeah,
right?
And I don't know that determinism rules out knowledge or truth. Even there's some bacteria that have light sensing mechanisms that will allow them to know where to head to, they're photosynthesizing bacteria. They know where to go. So they have some sort of truth or some sort of, even though they're not conscious of it, they're determined to go in that direction. So I don't know that, I mean, knowledge is a kind of I'm not a philosopher, so I don't really know what knowledge is. Knowledge is a psychological phenomenon that I can't explain, but I could just as well be a robot and do head towards the right direction that would save my existence versus crossing the road when there's a truck coming. Having knowledge of the situation around you can benefit can lead to your survival versus your extinction. So it's crucial to have knowledge, whether you call that psychological knowledge or mechanical knowledge or whatever you call it. There's some sort of truth there's kind of a winnowing of truth from untruth in order to even head in a certain direction.
Ken, were you at the book club when we did the Sam Harris book?
I was, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What side did you come down on? Were you like agnostic?
At the time, I was agnostic. I probably gravitate more towards determinism now. I just don't. I mean, I might be wrong. I don't see how it can obtain even under theism. Like, well, where does my desire to do the good, let's say if I have a choice between the good and the bad, where does that desire come from? And do I, even as a non-believer, if somebody said, okay, well, let's go out and let's go find a prostitute tonight, I couldn't do it. I feel determined that that's not in my character to do that. So the desire is not even there. For some others, the desire is there. So I don't know why some people have that and others don't. But I don't see that, free will to me, decisions either come from something that's determined or something that's random. There's really, they're kind of mutually exclusive. There's no third alternative. I just don't understand where this idea comes from that we could even manufacture ex nihilo, like Daniel was saying, this decision ex nihilo, where if it's just ex nihilo, then are we really the ones responsible? I mean, it's
Ken, at least we know that you're not a robot, because machines don't laugh.
So I have a follow-up to Ken. I'm actually kind of with Ken on this from a theistic perspective. I have similar thoughts about this. Phil, what do you think about to me, let's say, I vacillate in my head between free will and determinism myself. I'm not sure where I stand on this. There's a lot that just goes into the fog for me, but
Are you being determined to vacillate?
I see, this is the thing. So if you told me
I'm
my
sorry.
whole life, no, that's good. That's good. It's perfect setup from what I'm about to say. Thanks for the underhanded pitch there. It doesn't matter to me. Like, finally, like I imagine Ken would agree with me. Like, I feel like I've got choices, you know, I feel like I can go out and do things and go here or go there, go whatever. But to me, I want to agree with Ken here, because I don't think that, even if, let's just say from a theistic perspective, whether it's nature or God, the ultimate causation of everything, that I don't tend to think that doesn't ruin my party. I don't think that makes knowledge, that ruins knowledge for us. I'm perfectly happy. Like, I may be taking this out of context, but I look at Ephesians 2, 8, 9, and 10. And I feel like my life has been like that. Like, I'm glad God prepared works for me to walk into. I don't quite know how my volition and God's intentions worked out there, but let's say it's all predetermined. Psalm 139, all the days were written before me, before there was one of them. It doesn't bother me that God has determined that. I would plead with him that I would actually end up doing what he intended for me to do. But I don't think, or maybe you can just present the argument instead of me trying to pontificate here. How would determinism, naturally or theistically, how would that destroy knowledge? Does that really destroy knowledge?
Yes, it does. So we could review the line of thought that I was discussing earlier, and this is in the book, by the way. And this argument works with theistic determinism and with naturalistic determinism. But if you want to pursue it from the theistic determinism perspective, then we would start with, if determinism is true, then God determines all things about humanity. And when we say God determines all things about humanity, what we're saying is that the will of God is the cause of everything that occurs within a human being and about a human being. So if God determines everything about humanity, then God determines all of our thoughts, beliefs, and judgments. Our thoughts, beliefs, and judgments are being caused by something other than ourselves. That's what we mean by antecedent conditions. So if God determines all of my thoughts, beliefs, and judgments, then God determines all of my false thoughts, beliefs, and judgments. And we can reduce that to all of our false beliefs. And we know that we all have false beliefs, because two Christians can disagree on something and they will contradict each other.
On free will versus determinism, that's one thing they disagree on.
Right. It is. And
yeah.
And if two Christians contradict each other on any given theological belief or philosophical belief or any belief, period, then one of them is true and one of them is false. One of those beliefs is true and one of those beliefs is false. But God determines all beliefs. And if that's the case, he must determine all of our false beliefs, and he must determine Christians to hold false beliefs. And if he determines Christians to hold false beliefs, then God is a deity of deception, because deception is defined as causing or necessitating that someone hold a false belief, and they cannot do otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible for me to overcome God's causality. So if God is a deity of deception, then that means that every belief that I hold in my head is a belief that God has caused, and it could be one of the false beliefs that God has caused, and there's no way for me to know whether any one of those beliefs is a true belief that God has caused or a false belief that God has caused.
Well, you sound like a Calvinist there, Phil. You're not far from the kingdom, let me tell you, my man.
think he's arguing against
Well,
Calvinism. What I hear.
I'm arguing against Calvinism. I'm describing what Calvinism is all about.
Okay.
And I wrote a 400 page book called
Wow.
Calvin's Desperation. And in
Wow.
that book, Calvin's
What
Desperation.
was the title again? What was the title again?
Calvin's Desperation.
Calvin's Desperation. And in that book, I argue that if God determines all things and determines all things about humanity as Calvin stated and as Calvin believed and taught, then that means that human knowledge is absolutely off the table. Human epistemology is destroyed because everything that we believe could be one of the false beliefs that God is determining us to believe, and we don't know the difference. It's impossible for us to know which of our beliefs are true and which are false because we are determined to believe them for reasons that have nothing to do with truth. And the other problem with Calvinism, by the way, is that if God is a deity of deception and he inspired Scripture, then Scripture is untrustworthy. But Scripture is absolutely necessary for Calvinism to be true. So that's what made Calvin so desperate, because he ran headlong into a logical contradiction that he couldn't solve, and he became desperate, and he said, all right, God, you're going to have to solve this for me because I can't solve it for myself. And I described the problems that causes. They're catastrophic. So yes, under exhaustive determinism, human epistemology is completely impossible. But whenever I say that, and whenever I talk to either Christians or atheists, both, about that, the first response is, well, we have to have knowledge. We have to have a certain minimum level of knowledge in order to even function as human beings. So we have to have knowledge. And I would agree with that observation. But I want to make it clear that that observation is actually arguing against determinism. It's not arguing for determinism. Because if we can have knowledge, that means determinism is false. And the other aspect of this is that the very proposition knowledge is impossible is self-defeating. And I talk about this in the book, and so I'm sure that you read this, Ken, in the last chapter. If knowledge is impossible, then it's impossible to know that knowledge is impossible. And so the proposition knowledge is impossible is self-defeating. If it's self-defeating, it's automatically false. If knowledge is impossible is false, then the proposition knowledge is not impossible is automatically true. And so determinism implies a self-defeating proposition and consequent, and therefore is ultimately false. And that means that determinism is ultimately false.
I think your arguments are valid there. I just don't accept the premise that knowledge is impossible under determinism. I mean, that's a
Okay,
leap
well,
that I don't.
then what step in that logical progression would you find fault with, and would you?
I said, the premise that knowledge is impossible under determinism. You seem to take that for granted. I just don't see how you.
I just laid out a complex and a well organized logical argument that demonstrates.
Well, I just read it this evening before I agree with the soundness of the argument is sound, but one of the premises of your argument was that knowledge under determinism is impossible. I know you talked about it, but I just didn't quite. Maybe I'm slow, but I just don't quite understand how you get to that premise. The other premises I'm okay with, and the steps that you take using that as a premise, that argument is sound.
That is not a premise in the argument, Ken. That's the conclusion of the argument.
I'll bring it up again. I'll see if I can find it.
So, Phil, if I may, I just want to summarize what you said, if I understood it correctly. I think you said if God is determinant, he's determining things, specifically knowledge, then he's determining.
If he determines all things,
then he's determining the thoughts in individuals. And because individuals have contrary and opposite knowledge, that means that God would be contradicting himself.
Well, human beings have contradictory beliefs because all of us disagree on some things. So if God determines all things and he determines all of our beliefs, he determines all of our false beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, then God is a deity of deception, because deception, the definition of deception is to cause to have false beliefs in a way that cannot be otherwise. For God's will cannot be overcome or resisted. So we know that if God determines our false beliefs, then we cannot possibly hold a true belief in that particular case where he's determining us to have a false one.
I think I'm not speaking for Ken, but I think we're kind of on the same page here. But it sounds like, Phil, I mean, I think I love logic. Don't get me wrong. I think your argument, like Ken, I think it's sound, but I think when we're talking about, I think Ken said this earlier, where's the line between a, strong persuasion or whatever and determinism? And really, I think a lot of the logic boils down to a kind of anthropomorphic portrait of human ontology projected onto God with these either or things. When I see scripture, things like, Genesis 50:20, when Joseph tells his brothers that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, that somehow there was a determinism through the evil of Joseph's brothers to work good out. I'm thinking of Romans 8:2 as well, that God works all things together for good. So I think in this discussion, with even if the logic is razor sharp, are you leaving some room for divine omniscience, for some unknown here? I mean, I follow your argument in terms of I would totally agree that God is not going to contradict himself. But when we're talking about causality and human sin and even our knowledge, the noetic effects of sin, we don't know God as we ought to. I think in these razor sharp logical arguments that what's squeezed out of it is room for God to be God, and allowing omniscience to have a place in this discussion where we just finally say we don't know.
Well, I mean, what I'm ultimately doing is giving God back his right to be God, because if exhaustive divine determinism is true, then God is a deity of deception, and if he's a deity of deception, he's not the God of truth. And so what I'm arguing is that God does not determine all things. And so as long as we acknowledge that God does not determine all things, even though he may determine some things, he does not determine all things, and that solves our problem for us. That gives us our knowledge back.
Well, that's where I'm sorry. That's where that's the rub where I'm having, is how we know how God's ontological, epistemological relation is to human beings in regarding to causation. That when we're talking about God causes something, I'm thinking of, I made coffee this morning. I caused the mess in the kitchen. I caused the accident, or whatever the case may be. We're thinking in terms of human causes. And I'm not sure that that's entirely applicable to the way God maybe runs the universe, in other words. So when you're saying that God doesn't cause all things, I kind of say, well, wait a minute. How do we know the mind of God on this relation to his created order? That's where I'm a little hesitant to.
I would argue that we can know the mind of God in that sense, because we can know, using the rules of reason and logic that he has given us and that are grounded in his nature. We can use those rules of inference to conclude that if God does cause all things to occur in the universe, then we run into the problems that determinism causes, and those problems actually vitiate the goodness of God and vitiate the integrity of God. And so we have to conclude that those things, that this exhaustive divine determinism idea is false, because if it's true, God is not the God that we think he is. God is not good. God is not the God of truth, and God is a deity of deception. And I actually call him the demon of deception, if that's the case, because only demons deceive people. God does not deceive people. And so that's why we can be confident that this exhaustive determinism is not true. So, but this is kind of an in-house discussion, between Christians, and we're in the Atheist and Christian book club, and so I would, I don't want to leave the the atheist.
Well, by the way, Phil,
talking about theology, so
no, I was keeping it in between theism, atheism, naturalism.
By the way,
theism.
Phil,
Trying
I
to.
don't mind this in-house thing, but let me give you an example. I've known a Calvinist, me and Seb both, for 14 years. We were at dinner with a couple girls, and they just could not take the Calvinism anymore. They said, "You are the most condescending, arrogant person I've ever met in my life." And she flew out of there. And I went and said, "Look, he's just being a Calvinist." And she goes, "I just can't take it anymore." So my question personally to you, Phil, isn't it a waste of time trying to get through to the Calvinists, the exhaustive EDD guys?
It probably is.
Thank you.
And if you read my book, Calvin's Desperation, I don't know if you read it or not.
We need to do that book. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to do Calvin's Desperation, but again, that would be an in-house discussion. But I actually argue in the book, and some people have been very upset with me for saying this, but I believe that when a human being embraces a self-defeating, self-contradictory idea, a proposition, that leads to cognitive breakdown. It leads to, if I can use such a strong term, it leads to a diseased mind. Because if we believe in contradictory things, if we believe in two propositions, both of which contradict each other, and we say both of them are true, that's going to have a corrosive effect on our ability to reason, our ability to even think. It's going to have a detrimental
Cognitive dissonance.
effect. It's cognitive dissonance. It's going to have a detrimental effect on our mental health. And I believe with all my heart, and I hold this with this belief with fear and trembling, but I believe with all my heart that Calvinists are suffering from a mental disorder that is caused by believing in something that is self-contradictory. And anybody who believes in something that's self-contradictory is going to suffer a mental disorder. It's not just Calvinists. That's true of anything.
You think Ritalin would help?
It could be
Ritalin.
Yeah,
but Phil, you do have people like James
let
White.
Let me finish real quickly. The reason that I wrote Calvin's Desperation was not to convince Calvinists that their ideology is faulty. The reason I wrote Calvin's Desperation is to prevent people from getting sucked into Calvinism in the first place. And so a lot of my ministry, if you will, is about preventing people from falling into ideological traps that they cannot get themselves out of.
But Phil, here's where I come from. You have verses that the Calvinists use, John 6, I chose you, you didn't choose me, Romans 12, boy, if he can save you, he certainly can keep you. But then you have verses like in 2 Peter where he wants all to be saved. He wants all to come to him. So can you as a Christian just live with the tension and realize that there's contradictory verses, the Bible's full of contradictions, and just live with it?
Yeah. No.
Why not?
Because if the Bible is full of contradictions, the Christian faith falls apart.
Just Google Bible contradictions. There's 400 right when you Google it.
I went to seminary, conservative evangelical seminary, and it was nice because it wasn't a denominational, it was just evangelical. And I had one professor who was a staunch Calvinist and one who was a staunch Arminian. I read, Romans 9, and I was troubled by, I leaned towards Arminianism. That seemed more palatable to me. But I just couldn't get past Romans 9. And my Arminian professor said, "Oh, well, that's not talking about human free will in general. It's talking about this one specific case and Israel, yada, yada." But the principle is there. It's just hard to get around. It's just, I know people do it. People have explanations to get around it, but it just seems so cut and dried. And it's like, well, if you're really going to take the Bible at face value and you read Romans 9, you can't read anything but a Calvinist.
I would, first of all, we're kind of going down a bunny trail into Calvinism versus non-Calvinism. And
as soon as you're done, I want to steer us back. So finish with your thought.
I did find a page in your article, in your book, about the premise versus the argument, the outcome of the argument. It's on page 112. If determinism is, this is a premise. If determinism is true, knowledge is impossible. Knowledge is not impossible. Therefore, determinism is false. If God doesn't exist, does not exist, determinism is true. Determinism is false. Therefore, God exists. So all of those are sound. That's a sound argument. It's just that first line, that first premise. If determinism is true, knowledge is impossible. Now, you may have elaborated more on that elsewhere, but it didn't quite connect with me. I didn't
Yeah,
draw a line from point A to point B.
that is a premise in that argument.
Right.
But that argument represents the development of thought, and that argument is a final step in a series of arguments.
Right.
So
But maybe you could lay out for us why that in this book club now you could lay out for us kind of like, so in a way that simple mind can connect with, like, why is it that if determinism true, knowledge is impossible? Because when I see a cyanobacteria moving towards the light, not away from the light, it's got knowledge. I mean, knowledge is a loose term there, but it's got knowledge of where to go, what is the right place to go to get the light. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to make that move.
That stimulus and response is not knowledge.
Right, but
So,
I mean, I would argue that our brains are stimulus and response as well, and that it represents, and the responses that we have represent a form of knowledge.
well,
so don't fall.
that's a whole long series, the whole long discussion. But the premise, if determinism is true, knowledge is impossible. That is a premise in this advanced argument, but it is the conclusion of a previous argument.
Right, which I'm asking you now, if you can, to kind of encapsulate.
It's not something that I'm just taking for granted,
right.
Just because it's a premise in the argument in the later stages of the narrative.
I'm granting that, but I'm asking you to kind of lay it out simply for us right now. What is the best argument to encapsulate? Because I read your book about a year ago, about 3/4 of it, and then I picked up the latter part of it just this week. So I may not have connected with what I had read earlier because I didn't go back and reread.
I think he's already explained it a couple of times.
We've already gone through that argument twice.
But I just don't. I mean, what is? I know you dispute the fact that cyanobacteria have knowledge. I'm calling it knowledge. You're calling it a response. But I'm calling what I think, my convictions, they're a response to what I perceive to be true. It's a response. It's not.
Well, it's not the same kind of response that you see in bacteria. So the word response can have multiple meanings and multiple levels. So.
Yeah, it's much more complex for sure.
Right.
But I think it's qualitatively, from my point of view, it's qualitatively.
Let me ask this, if this will help. Phil, would you be able to go back and specifically pull the earlier argument out and put it in our Facebook group, the Friends of the Atheist and Christian Book Club? Because as you guys are talking about that, I can't remember how you made that connection either, because I was going to answer for you, but it was a well laid out series of ideas that built on each other. And so, and that might help us to go back at a later time in the Friends of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Could you do that for us, Phil?
I could do that, but I would suggest that I do it right now and I share my screen. I can just put the argument on the screen and then we can go through it step by step.
Okay, we if we could do it quickly here, because we are not covering really important parts of your book I'd like to get to, if we could.
Okay, I'll go through it real quickly. If naturalistic determinism is true, natural law determines all things about humanity. If natural law determines all things about humanity, natural law determines all of our beliefs, because beliefs are things about humanity. 3, if natural law determines all of our beliefs, it determines all of our false beliefs. 4, if natural law determines all of our false beliefs, natural law is deceptive in that it forces us to affirm false beliefs. That's the definition of deception. 5, if natural law is deceptive, it is untrustworthy as a source of knowledge. Because any source of knowledge that's deceptive is untrustworthy. We cannot gain trustworthy knowledge from it. 6, if therefore all, not just some, of our beliefs are based on an untrustworthy source. 7, if all our beliefs are based on an untrustworthy source, we have no way of knowing which of our beliefs are true and which are false. And then 8, if we have no way of knowing which of our beliefs are true or false, knowledge is impossible.
There's a lot of binary thinking in there. Like it sounds like you're gravitating towards untrustworthy. It's either trustworthy or untrustworthy. There's nothing in between. Like we can hold false beliefs, we can hold true beliefs. If you give me your phone number and I call you, and if I write it down and I don't write it down correctly and I call you, it's not going to go through. But if I write it down correctly and I punch it in right, and you hold up your phone, I can see you and you're answering it. Hey, Phil, I know that I have the right number. I didn't mess up the number. I called the right number. It's valid. It's kind of a prediction. If a prediction comes true, it's validated. It doesn't. Sure, there's untrustworthy aspects of our minds and our influences that come into our minds, but we also have means. It's number 7 there. I would directly refute that one. We have no way of knowing which of our beliefs are true and which are false. I just gave an example of a case where I can know whether it's true or false. If you pick up the phone, I know it's true. And don't tell me otherwise. I mean, you're just talking nonsense to me.
So you're saying scientific method.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just not. I mean, this is all syllogisms, but it doesn't have any applicability in the real world. It's meant to kind of obfuscate. It doesn't make sense.
This is all about the real world, because if this is true, if natural law determines all of your false beliefs, you have no way of knowing which of your beliefs are true or false.
Right.
And if that's the case, you have no way of knowing whether or not you're reading a telephone number on a screen. You have no way of knowing whether telephones even exist.
I mean, Descartes got, he plumbed the depths of his skepticism and he finally bottomed out at, I think, therefore I am. I mean, you have to stop somewhere. I mean, I could throw up my hands and say, no, I have no way of knowing anything. It's just all, my eyes and eyes are just jump off a cliff, because I have no way of knowing anything. But experience teaches us that we do have ways of knowing things. And
so what you're doing,
my bedrock is experience.
Well, but I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that, Ken. And what you're doing right now is you're arguing against determinism. Because you're saying determinism leads to a conclusion that is absurd, that I find absurd. And I agree with you, Ken Daniels. Phil Bair, agree with you, Ken Daniels, that conclusion that we can't have anything that we could call knowledge I think it's absurd, but just as much as you think it's absurd.
The whole argument here is that some beliefs are true and some are false, and we have no way of knowing which ones are which under determinism. Right. I agree. I agree that under determinism we have false beliefs and we have true beliefs, whether it's theism or determinism or free will. It doesn't matter. We all agree we have false and true beliefs, but that doesn't entail that everything is false and that everything is deceptive and everything is untrustworthy. It means that some things are trustworthy, and we have to winnow the things that are and aren't.
No, I think you're missing one of the original premises are that if naturalism is true, naturalism, determinism is true, then natural law determines all things about humanity. It determines all of our beliefs, and so something that is determining all of our beliefs, it is untrustworthy. So it's not saying all of our beliefs are false. What it's saying is that we can't trust those beliefs because it's being determined by something that is essentially and intrinsically untrustworthy. So when you say, Phil, I can't accept that conclusion, that knowledge is impossible, that none of our beliefs are trustworthy, I agree with you. But that conclusion necessarily follows from determinism. And so what you're doing is you're helping me argue against determinism at this point because you're raising valid points. I think that your experience of reasoning and going through a scientific method and drawing conclusions about reality, I think that experience is valid, and I think that it's authentic. I think you do have authentic knowledge.
Natural law can impel us to find ways to seek truth, because truth aids our survival, just like the cyanobacteria seeking the source of light aids its survival. Sometimes it's not perfect. Well, it's certainly far from perfect, but natural selection impels us towards more things that are true than that are false. And I agree with you up to point 1, point 2, point 3. But when you get to point 4, it causes us to affirm, well, yes, some false beliefs, yes, but they're not all false. And that doesn't entail that we can't, that number 7 is true. I mean, I just don't see that there's a straight line.
Okay, I think you're confusing that it affirms false beliefs, and that it affirms that it means that all of our beliefs are false. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that all of our beliefs are false. What we're saying is that all of our beliefs are determined, and if all of our beliefs are determined, it's impossible to know which ones are true or false. Therefore, all of our beliefs are untrustworthy because they're based on an untrustworthy, deceptive source. So what you're saying is true, but not under determinism. Because when you talk about natural selection, if you talk about how the scientific method works, and about our experience of reason and our experience of observing things and drawing true and valid conclusions, I agree with all that. I think you're right. But the problem is that that's not possible under determinism. Determinism means that can't happen. And we're saying, you and I, Ken, are saying, oh, yes, it can happen. I think we have reason to believe that it can happen. And so we have no choice but to reject determinism. That's where
that goes back to the cyanobacteria. Are you maintaining that under determinism, even under determinism, a cyanobacteria has untrustworthy sensations of where the light is, and that you can't be relied on?
And how do you say that bacteria? What's the name?
Cyanobacteria, CYANO bacteria that head towards the light to get to.
But that bacteria does not have beliefs.
Oh, I grant you that. I grant you that. But I'm going back to that because I think it exposes the hollowness of this argument that we is fundamentally untrustworthy. That we have no reason to trust anything about what we believe.
Yeah, and that's under determinism. That's true.
But
I would just say this so parallels our conversation about the free will, Sam Harris book, because it was like intuitively and experientially, we have free will. Everybody, you can't live your life as if you don't. Nothing works. But Sam Harris's answer to that is that free will is total deception. We actually don't have it. It's not true. Right. And so this is, I think, kind of where the same argument's leading here right now. Ken, you're right. This can't be actually true, even if it logically lines up. And if determinism itself is not true, then that's why we're having trouble with this syllogism.
Yeah, and the other thing that I heard you say, Ken, is you're talking about things that are true, and what this argument does not do, it doesn't say that there's no such thing as truth, and it doesn't say that there are no true beliefs, and it doesn't say that the bacteria that's following a light source is not doing something that has some kind of real validity and success or effectiveness in the natural world. None of those things are true of what we're discussing here. What we're discussing here is that we can't know that things are true or false. It's not that truth or false doesn't exist. It's that we can't know the difference between true and false, because everything that we think is true and false, we're being caused to think that those things are true and false by something other than ourselves, and we cannot resist that determining power of natural law. We can't resist natural law, and we can't say, all right, natural law, I'm not going to obey your determining force of nature, and I'm going to think something different, because if naturalism is true, it's impossible for us to do that. Natural law controls us 100%.
I would argue that yes, we are machines, that we are being controlled by all of the antecedents to whatever moment in time we live in, and we have no choice but to do and believe whatever whatever is antecedently determinative, just like a cyanobacteria. And it's going to impel, and more often than not, it's going to impel us to whatever is true, because truth aids in survival. If we thought that the water was south and the water was north, and we didn't obey the cues, we'd die of thirst. So I mean, it comes down to experience. It's like, well, and I have no problem thinking that we're machines are being impelled in one direction or another towards the truth. And my experience bears that out.
True, Ken? Is that itself true?
Well,
Ken?
I mean, at some point, you just have to throw up your hands and say, it is what it is, and it's based on experience. This is how I know, how things are true. It's things are predictable.
But isn't that not how you know things are true? Isn't it because they were determined outside of yourself?
Right, but our minds are equipped through evolution to have means of testing and understanding what is real and what is not real.
But Ken, that's a belief. That's a belief that you hold in
your
head.
But it's based on
and that belief is determined by natural law. It's not based on anything, because under natural law, all beliefs are determined. They're not based on things. And natural selection does not select for truth. It only selects for survival.
Well, experience is part of the determination, and experience tells me what's true and what's not. So it's determined. It's determined, but it's still true.
But Ken, the belief that experience tells you what's true and what's not is another belief that you have in your head that is caused by the forces of nature, caused by natural law, and therefore it's untrustworthy.
But it doesn't mean as much as I think as you're trying to make it mean. I think at some point, even though it's all mechanistic, we are determined to test things. You're like, when I call your number and I see you pick up the phone and I talk to you, through experience, it tells me, that validates that I'm on the right path. That's all determined, but it's still true.
But I can't. It's really hard for me.
You're trying to trip me up. You're trying to impose a kind of a top-down gotcha type thing. But I'm trying to work from the bottom up. I experience life as I experience it, and I experience truth and things that are real and things that are not real. And I don't mind whether it's determined or not. Doesn't bear on whether I'm coming up with the truth or not.
Bill, let me ask you.
I think what he would say on that is that, Ken, if you are really, truly, freely coming to that truth, based on empirical methodology or what have you, then your beliefs aren't determined. That you freely came to them on your own, and you're not locked into a system with no free either free will or free knowledge.
And Ken, I want to reinforce what you're saying, because when you say I had this experience of drawing truth and drawing valid conclusions from my observations, you're right. You are. I'm 100% behind you in that observation, because I think that your experience of truth and rationality and how you deliberate about things and how you might do science if you're a scientist, I think that all those things are valid, and I think that all those things are real. And when you tend to resist the idea that those things are all unreliable, you're right in resisting that idea, because they are. This is not a reliable framework. It cannot deliver knowledge to you. But you're saying,
stop there.
You're saying, but I do have knowledge.
You're saying it cannot deliver knowledge to you. That's a strong statement, and that's where I want to unpack that. Where do you get that can't from?
Because determinism only determines what you believe through the forces of impersonal, unintelligent natural law. Natural law has no intelligence, no intention, no purpose. There's no teleology in natural law.
Check.
Okay.
But I still don't see how you can put a word can't in there.
Because natural law, if there's no teleology in natural law, it's incapable of causing you to know something that's true, because natural law doesn't care about truth.
Right.
Maybe a better way to say that, Phil, is that it can give you things that are true, but it will also give you things that are false, and you will be unable to reliably distinguish.
Right. What I'm saying is that it can't deliver knowledge. I'm not saying it can't deliver truth. I'm saying it can't deliver knowledge. It
I
can
think
deliver
it can
something.
deliver a mechanism for vetting the truth.
It can cause you. It can cause you to believe something that is true, but you can't know that it's true. You can't know that what you believe is true, but what you believe may be true, but it may be true by coincidence. Natural law is not going to have any kind of intelligence or intention. Natural law doesn't have any purpose. It doesn't say, I'm going to make Ken believe something that's true, and I'm going to make it so that he can rely on what I'm making him believe. Natural law doesn't do that.
Well, I would say natural selection gives us brains that select for the truth. I mean, it's blind, but yes, it's a survival mechanism.
Yep, and that belief is a belief that you are determined to have if naturalism is true. If naturalism is true, you are determined to believe that natural selection is
Right.
giving you the ability to survive. And
just like any other belief that I have obtained through observation and reason that I've been endowed through my evolutionary history.
And every belief that you obtain through observation as religion is being determined for you. You're being determined to believe those things.
I think you're throwing out, you're equating determinism with unreliability. It's like, but I'm trying to push back and say, no, that's not necessarily the case. I think determinism can lead to truth. I mean, in the case of, a lot of us, yes, have false beliefs, but most of the things that we believe about everyday things anyway, have to be true. Otherwise we wouldn't survive. I mean,
yeah. And you're right. Absolutely. Determinism can lead you to truth. But the problem is that determinism cannot lead you to knowledge. Determinism cannot lead you to know that something is true.
But it gave us tools that we can predict. We can make predictions. When I call your number and it gets in and you pick up the phone, that might predicted that you were going to pick it up if it was true. And so then that validated my prediction.
And that whole
mechanism was endowed upon me deterministically by natural selection.
Yeah, I think the confusion for me, Phil, and if I'm hearing you right, Ken, is that if you're differentiating between knowledge and truth, to me, truth is in the same basket as knowledge, and now we've drawn a line that I think is quite artificial in terms of this discussion, in terms of like, well, I can't have knowledge, but I can be led to truth by determinism. Doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, if determinism can lead me to truth, then it should give me some substance of knowledge as well. I think I'm not sure we've unpacked the knowledge and truth definitions sufficiently. So my point may be moot, but I kind of share Ken's view in the sense that, having talked to a lot of atheists, I can at least now understand this from an atheist perspective as to why this is a frustrating argument. Because, like, okay, the sun rises and the moon is in cycles, and all of these things seem to happen regularly, and there are certain principles and laws that occur regularly that are something I could trust. It doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, but if determinism can get me to truth, then it should give me some semblance of knowledge, which is what I think I hear Ken saying.
Yeah, no, and that's not true, because if determinism leads you to truth, it's doing it accidentally. It's not doing it through intention.
Oh, I'm not saying there's intention there, but you're saying that it can bring you to truth, though it's not intentional. But it's still, if I can get truth out of it, then I should be able to get knowledge out of it as well.
No, that's not true. No, it's not true, because if you can't know that you're getting truth out of it, because natural law may lead you to truth, but natural law is also leading you to falsity. So, and we don't know whether or not any given belief that we have in our head is true or false, because natural law is behind both of them, and natural law doesn't care about truth.
But I would push back. You're an Arminian or a Molinist, and then there's Calvinists that are equally or more convinced about the truth of what they believe. You still have the same problem. Whether you call it from God or from free will or from determinism, we're all in the same boat. There's things we're confronted with that we don't know whether they're true or not, and we struggle to know. And I don't think that the knowledge, the belief that God created you gives you a leg up over anybody else. I mean, you're still gonna you still don't know whether your views on Molinism or whatever, what have you, are the correct ones to have.
Although it's possible to know which ones are correct because we're not being determined to believe all the things that we believe. So that's the reason that I reject Calvinism just as much as I reject naturalistic determinism. All determinism destroys knowledge.
So Phil,
but your free will is still subject to error as well. Right?
Yeah, that's true. But the problem is that the error is not being determined. The error is happening because we're making
error prone. So you can't have knowledge of the truth then.
That's not true, because we can be careful and we can avoid error by being careful.
Pull yourself up with your own bootstraps.
We can avoid error by being careful, but that's not possible under determinism because our error is being determined under determinism. Under libertarian freedom, our error is not being determined. It could be otherwise, and we can be careful and we can avoid error by being careful and using the reason that God has given us.
And I would say natural selection gives us tools to make predictions and to follow up and to vet things that whether they're true or not. It gives us those tools.
What gives us those tools?
We're the tools to discriminate between, to make predictions and to follow the outcomes and gain knowledge as a result of that.
No, I say what is giving you those tools?
Natural selection.
Okay. How do you know that natural selection is giving you the tools to gain knowledge if that belief is being determined by natural law and you have no idea whether or not it's one of those false beliefs that you're being determined to believe?
Well, experiences tells me that we have ways of gaining knowledge. You and I both agree on that, right? That we have ways of gaining knowledge. I believe that I have the ability to gain knowledge. You believe you have the ability to gain knowledge. I look at the world. I look at all the evidence for the antiquity of the earth and an evolutionary process. There's lots of lines of evidence that point. I use reason, the same reason that I use to determine when I'm coding computer programs and I get an outcome that I like or that I don't like, I can discriminate between those. I can also apply that same logic to look backwards at evolutionary history, at the evidence for evolution, and say the evidence, the same types of lines of evidence that lead me to believe.
I understand.
So then I apply that and I go backwards, and the evidence points in that direction, so I accept it. Now you're coming and telling me, well, I can't do that. Well, I don't know where the gap is.
Ken, I'm not telling you that you can't do that. I'm telling you that naturalism makes it impossible for you to do that. And
right,
so since we both agree that you can do that, that forces us to reject naturalism, because under naturalism, those things are impossible. Your belief,
I don't follow. It doesn't follow.
Your belief that you can deliberate and you can examine evidence and you can do all these things, that belief is being determined for you by natural law that has no intelligence, no intention, no teleology. It doesn't care about truth. It's simply forcing you through its natural forces to believe that you can go through and deliberate and observe and draw conclusions based on the evidence and things like that. That belief that you can do
you're hung up on the fact that it's deterministic means it can't be reliable. But I'm saying that
that's right.
I dispute that. That premise I reject.
Well, if that's the case, then you have to go through that argument and you have to point out how that argument is invalid. And if you can't point out how that argument is invalid,
7.7, you said we have no way of knowing, whether things are true or false. But I would say that evolution has given us a mechanism whereby we can, through testing.
You guys are going in circles. If I may just interject real quick, I think what Phil is saying is that if we live under determinism, we do not have the ability to test and learn.
But I reject that. I reject that premise.
Well,
then you're rejecting determinism.
I think you're confusing what determinism entails. Determinism doesn't mean that I can't. That doesn't mean that I'm not equipped to to take in evidence. Just like I can feed in data into a computer and it can spit out You know, some things that, you know, I couldn't have predicted. But
Ken, here's the problem. Your belief that you can do those things,
mhm.
if determinism is true, your belief that you can do those things was determined for you. You were forced to believe that you can do those things
Based on experience.
by natural law, and natural law doesn't care about truth, and natural law routinely causes you to have false beliefs. So it's impossible for you to know whether that belief is true or false, because it's one that you're being determined to believe by natural law.
Yeah, we're just going to go around in circles. I mean, I kind of I have a glimpse of kind of what you're trying to get at, but I don't think it's a tight enough argument to say like where. I mean, if you bring up those what 9 points or whatever it was, I mean, I wanted to camp out on points 4 and 7 there that really I just couldn't I couldn't draw that line that you were drawing.
Well, 4 is true by
I think what we're
definition.
going to have to do is try to pick this up in the Friends of, and we're down to like 8 minutes. And so at least as a segue for next month, just to start the discussion, because we can't really get into this at this point. But I did want to raise this issue of the Epicurean dilemma. Our book next month is going to be Graham Oppie's little book on the conversations about God and the problem of evil. So, Phil, on page 23, you talk about the Epicurean dilemma. So real quickly, who was Epicurus? What was his dilemma? Why is it so pervasive? And what is the best theistic solution to it?
Yeah, Epicurus was a Greek philosopher, and I don't have the dates of his life memorized, but he lived sometime before Christ, 200 or 300 BC, something like that. I think he might have been a contemporary of Socrates or Socrates or Aristotle. But the Epicurean dilemma that he came up with was basically that if God, if evil exists, God either cannot prevent evil or he will not prevent evil. And if God can prevent evil, then he would prevent evil. And if he doesn't prevent evil, that means that either he can't, which means that he is not omniscient or omnipotent, or he won't, which means he's not omnibenevolent. And if that's the case, and evil truly exists, then according to Epicurus, God could not possibly exist logically, because that you're talking about a being that is logically contradictory in his own nature. Does that?
Yes. Why is that so pervasive? Why is it that, over 2,000 years later, we're still trying to deal with this dilemma?
I'm not.
You've overcome it. So we'll talk about that next too, real quickly.
Well, I think the reason why this is such a powerful issue is that it is extremely emotional. And the reason why it is so emotional is because many of us have lost family members to tragedy. And we immediately go to this idea that why didn't God prevent this tragedy that caused so much pain and heartache in my life? If he's good, how come, why would he not prevent a child getting cancer? Why wouldn't he prevent a busload of kids sailing off of a cliff and killing everybody aboard? And so because it is so emotional, it is extremely difficult to navigate in a rational way. And I asked Bart Ehrman why he decided to deconvert, and he told me that he just couldn't accept the possibility that God could allow so much suffering and so much evil in the world. And so it is so powerful that it can tend to obscure our clear thinking processes, and we can tend to not approach it from a rational perspective just because it is so powerful. That's my opinion about the matter.
That kind of sounds illogical, right? I'm not going to believe in God because I don't like him.
I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification.
Essentially, that's what he's saying.
Yeah. but my argument is that if God does not exist, then what is our basis for calling anything evil or tragic? What's wrong with suffering if there's no such thing as God?
Right.
Can you
And
really
so-
say that? I'm dumbfounded whenever I hear that argument trotted out. It's like as if we don't experience suffering in a very real way. I mean, it's like how can you say that suffering is, but you said something about how can you say that suffering is bad? I mean, experience. Suffering we hate suffering. It's horrible, especially when it's extreme.
But why is it a problem that we hate suffering?
I'm just saying that, I mean, I was responding to your assertion that there's no way to know that suffering is bad. I mean,
I'm not saying that there's no way to know. I'm saying if God does not exist,
mhm.
then we have no basis for calling anything evil. We have no
Well,
basis.
okay. Let's take the word evil out of it.
We have no basis for objecting against suffering.
Okay,
because-
yeah. So yeah, we're using all kinds of different terms there, but I'm just saying suffering for me is a negative thing. I can say that without any reference to God or I mean, it doesn't matter whether God exists or not. And suffering for me is something that's negative.
Right. And the problem is, why is that a problem? That suffering is negative for you. If there's no God and you just appeared out of the soup,
Mhm.
why is it a problem for you to?
It's not for me. I mean, it's a negative thing. I experience it negatively, but I'm not making any sort of claim about it.
Why is it a problem that it is a negative thing for you or anybody else?
It only becomes a problem when you introduce the idea of an omnipotent, benevolent, omniscient, omnipotent being. That's when it becomes an issue. A God is a God who's claimed to be a God of love, who provides in Psalm 104. I think you were there in the meeting we were with Eric the last couple months ago, where I read Psalm 104. There are definite claims about God's nature and what it means to be a God of love. He provides to all his creatures, and so there's certain claims that are being made within the theistic framework. When I'm standing outside the theistic framework, it's not an issue.
Kendra, what you're saying, make sure I'm understanding you right. What you're saying is, if there is no God and no purpose, then we are in exactly the kind of universe you would expect, full of suffering. And okay,
Right.
So how do Christians then explain, okay, there's a good God that could stop it? Well, now you got a problem, because why didn't he?
If I see somebody being raped on the street corner and I just walk by and don't do anything, then I could be considered culpable for just negligence, not intervening. But yet routinely people suffer, are raped or starve or whatever, whether it's human caused misery or natural misery. And I tend to focus on the natural misery more, because I know that human misery oftentimes, human free will is invoked. So I kind of tend to push that away and say, well, no, what about?
And Christians also introduce this idea of actual evil, not just suffering, but suffering with a personal evil intent. So if you have a personal God who's all knowing, he knows about it, he's all powerful, he could stop it, he chooses not to stop it. That's what I think he's saying, Phil, introduces the problem. That's the Epicurean dilemma. If you don't have God, you don't have a problem with it. Am I right? Is that right?
What I'm saying is that if you don't have God, then you don't have evil anymore.
Exactly.
But the problem is that the fact that evil is real is the basis for people claiming that God does not exist. But that's self-defeating, because if God does not exist, then evil does not exist.
So let's take the word evil out of it for the purpose of this conversation. Let's just talk about extreme suffering. Okay. So we all agree extreme suffering exists, right?
Yeah, but I don't want to take evil out of it, because evil is intrinsic to the argument.
Well,
Suffering is not intrinsic to the argument.
I think suffering is the basis of it. I mean, evil is synonym. Oftentimes, historically, the evil is seen as suffering and evil are kind of intermixed. But I think Epicurus was, when we used the word evil, he was meaning just suffering in general.
Evil includes intent.
No, according to Epicurus, the
Mhm.
fact that people suffer is evil. That's the problem.
Okay,
That's the
well,
problem.
I
That's the
can't
problem of
defend
evil.
Epicurus, but I can defend what I believe. So when I'm, as a non-theist, suffering for me just is, right? I experience it negatively. My family, my friends experience it negatively, but it just is. I don't call it evil. I call it suffering. So are we good with that?
Well, I'm good with that, but what we've done is that's a departure from the problem of evil at that point, because now
Well,
you're
okay, well,
talking
let's
about.
use Ken's problem of suffering instead of Epicurus' problem of evil.
Okay,
So when I see in Psalm 104, where God is loving toward all he has made and he provides for them. And, I could read it over again, but you might call it just metaphorical or whatever, but it's very explicit about the nature of God and what it means to be a God of love and provision. And when I look at the world, I just don't see that. So I see a contradiction between what's claimed about God and what I observe in the world.
there's no contradiction there at all, because I'm a father. I have two daughters, and when I was raising my daughters and they were young and they did something wrong, I had to punish them, and when I punished them, I was causing suffering.
Mhm.
But I caused their suffering because I loved them, because I knew that their suffering was going to be good for them. So it's simply not true that a God of love would always have to prevent people from suffering or would never allow suffering. It's simply not true, because suffering can be part of love in a fallen world.
I think
Yeah.
maybe that the atheists I've had these kind of discussions with raise a good point that yes, you could maybe put some suffering in the category of therapeutic or justice or some other a personal God wanting to, for our own good, have us suffer, and there certainly is value in some suffering. But
Building
that's really
character.
hard to take all suffering and put it in that category.
And it's for
The
me, especially
pervasive
animal
nature
suffering.
of it. And go ahead. I'm sorry, Ken.
And for me, especially animal suffering. I know Eric talked about maybe all animals go to heaven, but where do you draw the line between tapeworms and toads and snakes and lizards and
I draw a line with
porcupines?
cats even.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
If you
Well, I
got
mean, if you want to retool the argument and retool the discussion, that's fine. But we're no longer talking about the argument or the problem of evil. We're talking about the problem of pain at this point. And
And to me, that's what's always been the issue for me, not
okay, and the problem of pain does not do any harm to the existence of God, and doesn't even do harm to the existence of a benevolent God.
I
Because
agree it's not a logical problem. I don't subscribe to the logical problem of suffering, but more of the evidentiary, like a fawn that's, I forget the name of the philosopher, begins with an A, but I read a book about, it's called by a bunch of philosophers, called The Evidentiary Problem of Evil. Alston, I think it is. He talked about imagine a fawn in the forest, and there's a fire, and the fire ravages the forest, and the mother dies, but the fawn lives for 4 days and is suffering intensely, and finally expires. That 4 days of suffering, yeah, you can make up maybe you could imagine some ultimate divine purpose for why that should be, but I'm just saying that me looking from the outside in onto that scenario, I have a hard time thinking that God must have had some reason for that.
okay, so if you have a hard time believing that God had good reasons for that, does it follow from that God didn't have good reasons for it, or that God does not exist?
No, it's more of a probabilistic thing. It's an observation that the world looks like it would look as if there was no benevolence behind it. I'm not making a strong argument. It is, again, an emotional argument, but it does look to me like a world in which either God doesn't exist or he purposely decides he's not going to intervene.
Well, Ken, hold that thought, because we want to address this and get into, we'll resolve next month the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. And so we will come back to these ideas. I'm glad we got to at least start this question before we look at Graham's book. And so watch for the atheistchristianbookclub.com or also our Facebook pages, and you can see how you can get links to the book. And that's going to be again on September 5th at 7 p.m. That's Thursday, September 5th. And let me say thank you, Ken, for the great questions. Bill, Seb, good things to add to that conversation. Daniel, Ray, as always, good thoughts. Phil, thank you for being our guest author. And
Yeah,
I
thanks
hope you
for
continue
providing
to be
this forum. It's great. I enjoy it. I mean, we get contentious sometimes, but I think, you know, if it weren't for things like this, we would have so many blind spots that, you know, it would just be, you know, we'd be even. So now we do have mechanisms for reinforcing our.
Well, I do want to make a quick, just a couple quick closing comments, if that's okay. I said this at the beginning of one of my other podcasts when we were talking about whether Calvinism is a different gospel, and I had my friend Tim Stratton on as a guest. The first thing that we introduced that podcast by saying, I could be wrong. Phil, I could be wrong about these things. I could be mistaken. So you take any random thing in Machines Don't Laugh, I could be mistaken about anything that I wrote in Machines Don't Laugh. I have to always admit and have the humility to admit that it's logically possible for me to be mistaken about all the things that I say. My intention is not to be the man who knows everything and who has all the answers and is always right about everything. My agenda is to provide logical arguments so that people can grapple with the arguments themselves and detach the personality from it. And if someone wants to say that the argument I'm presenting is faulty, then I want them to give me a rational reason why it's faulty. But it's always possible that it could be faulty. And I want to make it clear that I don't want to come to this with any discussion with the attitude that I have to be right about this and I'm automatically right and you guys are automatically wrong if you disagree with me. I could be wrong. And so I wish I'd said that at the beginning, because that's the way that I really want to frame this thing. I want to frame it in humility always, you know, so.
Well, I appreciate that attitude. And what I like about this book club is that attitude comes across on both sides of the aisle. And it's something we can always get better at. And I've learned a lot of my weak points, my cognitive biases, and you know, my faulty thinking. So that's still a work in progress. But thanks so much, everybody, for being part. I know we have some new people this time. Seb, you've been here before?
I think once a while back.
Okay, been a while.
I see Bill often, and I really wanted to join this month. So.
Well, thanks so much, and I hope you can be a regular with us. And there's some other faces and names that I saw without faces that I didn't recognize. Thank you so much, everybody. And until next month, let's have a good book to read and come back and have some friendship fellowship together. Thanks so much.
And thank you guys for having me. I really, really appreciate it. I was honored to be the guest. So thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who made comments.
Thanks, Phil.